Hello, everyone. I'm Tina Fakhrid-Deen, and I'll be sharing some information with you for today's lecture on the bones of an essay and understanding the rhetorical situation. If you look in your D2L module for this week, you should see um, a document entitled The Bones of an Essay, and you can use that to take notes. So if you need to pause now and pull that up, download it to your computer so you can follow along and type some notes, feel free to do that. But you don't have to. It's just there to support you with this video and kind of how that document is broken down. There are several questions. Why do we write? What are the steps in the writing process? What are the mechanical bones of an essay? And what are the 6 elements of the rhetorical situation? And so those are all of the things that we will cover during this mini lecture, okay? So let's talk about the reasons why we write. In my opinion, writing is a written conversation. We write to express our ideas, share our ideas with others. Unless it's a journal entry, typically we're writing for an audience, okay? And so there are a lot of different reasons why we write. Stop and think for a second about all of the reasons why you have chosen to pick up the pen or put fingertips to your keyboard. Sometimes it's to write an assignment. Sometimes it's to write a letter to a government official, to either applaud them or to complain about a certain situation going on in your community or in your nation. Sometimes you are writing in order to advocate on behalf of others. I know I write a lot of letters actually. I write letters of recommendations for my students so that they can get into four-year institutions. I've had to write letters for my daughter to advocate for her around a school issue. Sometimes I've written for a staff member that was about to be fired due to funding and advocating as to why the institution should keep that person. Sometimes I'm writing to apply for a fellowship or a grant. Sometimes I'm writing just to inform you of what's going on in the course, right? So there are a lot of different reasons we write. And then in terms of purpose, we write for a variety of ways. Sometimes we're writing to persuade, sometimes we're writing to educate, sometimes we're writing to report out on something, sometimes we're writing in order to entertain. Like if you are a screenwriter or you are a fiction writer, you're trying to entertain as well, right? So there are a lot of different reasons why we write. Sometimes it's cathartic to get things down on paper. Sometimes we are trying to educate someone around a specific issue. Sometimes we're trying to incite people to action. There's a lot of reasons why we write, and I can think of dozens off the top of my head. So which ones can you think of as reasons why people choose to write? Next, let's talk about what are the steps in the writing process. Writing can be broken down into kind of 4 different areas. Collecting, meaning collecting your ideas. Shaping, which means trying to lay out the best format for the thing that you're writing. Drafting, creating a first draft or second draft of it. Revising that work so that you can finally produce a polished final draft, right? And so when we're talking about collecting, you're talking about collecting ideas. What is it that I want to say? Sometimes, especially for me, that's like the most difficult thing. What do I want to write about? I'm a playwright, and so often I'm thinking about what things do I want to write about? What's interesting me in the world right now that I am motivated and interested enough to sit and write 120 to 140 pages about, right? And so the first and probably hardest thing to do is to sit down and figure out of all of the things that we can write about, what specific ideas do we want to tackle in our writing? And so that's where your brainstorming is coming in and writing down different ideas and creating essay maps to figure out possibly where this idea can go and what aspects of this particular topic or idea we want to engage in. Because remember, topics are huge webs, and so there are so many different angles that you can write from. There's a saying that there is nothing new under the sun, just new ways of approaching it, right? And part of that is because we are part of a larger conversation around that same topic. So you're collecting your ideas, but then you're shaping your ideas. And in terms of an essay, that's when we figure out what is the best layout, what's the best format for us to write this idea out in. Meaning, how can it be organized to be most useful in expressing ideas, getting our points across, and doing so clearly so that the reader, which is our audience, can actually understand what it is that we're trying to say. The next thing you need to do after you have figured out how to best shape this essay and what things you might need, like research and evidence, you start with a draft, right? And you're getting your ideas down, and these are your initial ideas. Remember, we have to get away from the one and done method of writing, meaning 3 hours, 2 hours, 45 minutes before the essay is done, trying to just crank out, the best that we can come up with. Well, yeah, that might be the best you can come up with, but what could you have come up with if you actually had an opportunity to revise, receive feedback, and then take those notes that we've received from other individuals and apply them to the essay? What then? What could have evolved in that work to improve the quality of it? And so that's what we're going for in the drafting phase. Make sure that you get into the habit of creating drafts for yourself. Again, I'm a professional writer. I am not writing an essay and submitting a first draft. I wouldn't do that with an editor for a magazine. I wouldn't do that for my own blog. For my own blog. And my blog is for me. That's actually one of my journal spots. And I edit those pieces many times before I post it. Because again, my first ideas, though they might be good, may not be the absolute best that I can conjure up, right? With a little bit more thought behind it. So always give yourself enough time to actually do the writing and drafting phase so that you're not up against the wall giving the best I could come up with in 45 minutes. As opposed to, no, I had a full week and let me use that week in order for me to get ideas generated, get feedback necessary so that I can come back and take another shot at making that essay the best that it can possibly be. So the third step would be the drafting phase, where you are actually getting feedback from other individuals, and that's where tutoring becomes important. Oakton has some fantastic tutors in our learning center, and so you do need to at least twice the semester reach out to tutoring and get support on your essays. We will also engage in writers workshop in the class so that you can get feedback from other members of the class. Because remember, you are not writing just for you. You're writing for an audience. That's a public facing document. And so think about every professional writer, whether that person is a playwright, whether they are a novelist, a memoirist, or writing in the newsroom for a newspaper. You have the writer, but then before you are publishing those things, you have an editor. Why? Because good writing usually requires other eyes to help us to see the things that we didn't see on our first or second go round. So it is, people think writing is a solitary sport, and in some ways it is, getting that first draft, but after that, usually we're releasing it to other individuals to help us to improve that draft before we create that final draft and then publish that polished piece to the world. So remember to use your resources. Me, your classmates, the tutoring center, and another important key are fantastic librarians who will help you to um, gather your research, which you will need for a few of the papers in the class. The last step then, after you've gotten all this feedback, is for you to figure out which feedback, what do you actually need? Sometimes people are given advice where they are trying to be helpful, but it's not really useful for you, or you don't want to take that direction or that approach to your writing. But then other things are very important and necessary. And so now the final phase is your revising phase, for you to use the feedback that is useful and generative to your writing, and then go back to that draft and revise it, refine it, so that you can produce a final draft. Okay? So let's move on from what are the steps of the writing process to what are the mechanical bones of an essay. Now, this is easy. The truth is, when we are writing an essay, you have certain expectations when you're reading someone's essay, and your audience has specific expectations when they're reading your essay. And depending on the type of essay, we have specific expectations. You can't write an argument essay if you never argued something, right? You gotta take a side. You have to take a stance because it's an argument essay, so we're expecting that from you. But if we're just going basic bones, we know that we must have an introduction. We know that inside of that introduction, we must give some background information about our topic, and we need a strong thesis statement that is clear, right, about what journey you're about to take us on as a writer. You also need body paragraphs that are sharing your main ideas that go under that larger idea. We know that in those body paragraphs with those main points, we better have evidence, because why should people believe us if we haven't proved what we're saying to be true, to be valid, to be valuable, right? And then we know that after we have our body paragraphs, whether that is 5 body paragraphs or it's a 10-page paper, so we have 20 body paragraphs, we know that we always must end just as strongly as we started, with a strong conclusion that doesn't just reiterate our ideas, but also shares some final reflections and thoughts about that topic and why, again, we should be listening to you as the writer. Now let's move on to the rhetorical situation. Aristotle came up with 6 elements of writing or rhetoric. When we think rhetoric, always think argument or persuasion. Rhetoric means the art of persuasion. Okay? And so typically, when we are standing before an audience to speak, or when we are writing, we are trying to get something across. And often we are trying to persuade someone to do something. Whether we are watching a commercial that someone wrote up and then had actors act out, often they're trying to convince us to buy a specific product, right? Whether it's a politician that's standing up reading from a prompter that someone wrote for them, they are trying to convince us that their ideas will help us in society, and ultimately that we should vote for them so that they can do whatever they are promising to do, right? And so there's 6 different areas to the rhetorical situation, and I'll go through the 6. The first thing is the writer or the speaker, right? And so the writer is the person who has written the piece, so that's you. Or if you're reading someone else's work, that's another writer. Or the person who is speaking. That's actually the most important element of the rhetorical situation, because everything here flows from you as the writer. So the second aspect of the rhetorical situation would be, what's the topic that this writer is writing about? What's the issue? Yes? Then, now that this writer has their issue or their topic, what's the purpose of them writing this? What are they trying to do? Are they trying to educate me? Are they trying to inform me? Are they trying to convince me or persuade me? Are they just trying to entertain me? What's the reason for them writing? And so you as the writer, you have to figure out, what's my reason for writing about this? Out of all the topics in the world I could have chosen, I chose this one. Why? Why is this so important for me? What's the purpose? What do I want my audience to gain? How do I want them to react? What do I want them to do as a result of me crafting this paper? And so then the fourth area of the rhetorical situation is your audience. Remember, you're not writing for you, you're writing for us. And so when you're thinking about your audience, you have to think strategically, critically about what's the best way. What are the best strategies for me to use as a writer, which are rhetorical strategies, in order to best persuade or convince this audience? What if it's a tough crowd? What if you're actually writing to the people who think very differently from you on this issue? You have to have a certain approach so that you can actually convince them. And so sometimes being combative towards the people that you know disagree with you isn't the best way to convince anyone. So what was the point of you writing that if you're not actually persuading them of anything? You're actually repelling them and upsetting them, right? So approach becomes important. Thinking about who's my audience? What's the best way to go about reaching them? All right? Whether that's emotionally, whether that's logically. How do I reach this audience that I'm trying to write to? Then you have to think about context. That's the fifth area. And so remember, we are not writing in silos, right? Our conversation is part of a larger, much larger and wider canon, right? This is a wider conversation. Just because this is the first time that I may be talking about sexually transmitted diseases doesn't mean that it's the first time it's been talked about, right? Of course not. There are different people talking about the same topic. Just because we're just now talking about COVID doesn't mean it's the first time it's being talked about, right? Absolutely not. It's been talked about in many other contexts, and we're on COVID-19. So what were the first 18, right? So that would take us understanding that this is part of a canon, a bigger context, and we have to figure out which context are we writing from, or has this writer written from? What's the setting? What's the cultural context? What's the historical context? What's the political context? What's the environmental context? What's the gender context, right? Because there's so many different ways, and maybe you're only focusing on a couple different contexts. Maybe you notice in a person's writing, they're missing an essential context, like the economic context to this situation, right? Those are the kind of thoughts and that's the kind of thinking that you have to have when you are engaging with the page, right? What are the contexts that I'm operating out of? The last thing of the rhetorical situation when we're talking about elements would be genre. What's the best vehicle? That's what genre is. What's the best vehicle in order for me to share my ideas? Is it through, an essay? Is it through a poem? Is it through writing a play? Is it through crafting an email or a text? Is it through writing a song? Those are all different genres, right? If we're only talking academically, is this best as an essay? Is it best as a lab report, actually, right? There are different types of writing that you will be forced to do as a college student. And so here, genre, when we're thinking about all the different layers of it, we're talking about in our class specifically. So it's a composition class, which means it's primarily going to be essays and written responses. And so you also have to think about what type of essay am I writing? Because every essay has slightly different rules to it. An investigative essay has different rules from an argument essay. An argument essay has different rules from a responding to literature essay. A responding to literature essay has different rules for a narrative essay. And so that's why you have to not only watch lectures, but also read the textbook I have for you, because it lays out in the textbook what are the rules for that specific type of essay, that genre of essay. What are examples? What are expectations for me as a writer, right? Because that's how you're being assessed on the rubric. So those are the different areas that you are thinking about when we talk about rhetorical situation, which you will hear me talking about a lot during the semester. The writer, the topic, the purpose, the audience, the context, and the genre. If you have other questions, I look forward to talking to you this semester, working with you this semester. Remember, if you read my syllabus, I talk about the various ways that you can contact me. I have a number on there that you can reach me at. You can reach me during student hours. You can email me. If you have questions, reach out. But also remember, you have your tutors. And so I am forcing you to reach out to tutors because that's actually a best practice for strong college students. And sometimes we get into the mentality of thinking that tutoring is somehow bad, that tutoring means that we are dumb, and that's silly. It's actually the strong students who know to use their reinforcements, use the supports that they are actually paying for. As a writer, I would never put work in the world that hasn't gone through an editor first. Period. Because I know that's a bad practice and won't produce the best writing. And so I'm hoping that you will take that away from this as well. That writing isn't just about you, it's about an audience, but also before you can produce a public facing document, right, which is a published piece of writing, that first you need to call on your reinforcements and use the writing supports that you have at your disposal, which are your instructor, your peers during writer's workshop, tutors, and the librarian. All right, have a great day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.